Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear from the last of the Exova witnesses. So could you ask
Dr. Pearson.
Dr. Pearson to come, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Please can I ask you to read the witness affirmation text that appears on the screen?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pearson. Would you like to sit down and make yourself comfortable? Right? Yes, Miss Grange.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I think someone told me that the sound system may be off. Is that right?
I'm sorry, Dr.
Okay.
Pearson. It looks as though we've got a slight technical hitch at the moment.
Can you hear me when I'm speaking? Yes. Sorry, that's better. I think it's just come on. Thank you.
Yes, Miss Grange.
Yes. Good morning,
Good
Dr.
morning.
Pearson. Thank you very much for attending today to give your evidence. It's very much appreciated. If you have difficulty understanding anything I'm asking you in the course of my questions, please can you ask me to repeat it or put the point in a different way? And if you feel you need a break at any point, please just let us know. Also, please try and keep your voice up so that the transcribers just sitting to your right can hear you. Now, you've made one statement to the inquiry. Can I please take you to it? It's also in a folder on the desk in front of you. It's a witness statement dated the 16th of October 2019, and we find that EXO 401753. Yes, thank you. And if we can go to the last page on page 7 of that. Is that your signature there?
It is.
Thank you. And have you read the statement recently?
Yes, I have.
And can you confirm that the contents are true?
I can.
Great.
To the best of my knowledge, yes, they are.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I want to start with asking you some questions about your background and your experience. Can we look at paragraph 2.1 of your witness statement? This is on page 1. So there you tell us in the first part of that you studied mechanical engineering at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Do you see that there?
Yes. Yes.
And later in the paragraph, you say that you went on to undertake a PhD in fire behaviour, which was co-supervised by the University of Poitiers in France.
Yes.
And Professor Dougal Drysdale at the University of Edinburgh. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
So is it right that you have extensive academic knowledge of fire behaviour?
I like to think so, yes.
Yeah. Now, we know that you were working at Exova from 2008, and in the autumn of 2013, you became a senior consultant at Exova. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Now, can you just help us as to what that means, the senior consultant, in terms of the hierarchy of positions within Exova?
The basic grading, you would, assuming that you're joining the company with no or very limited practical experience, you'd start off as a graduate. So somebody who is not expected to be, apologies, capable of working unsupervised. A consultant is then the next grade, somebody who is trusted to be a project manager on a relatively simple project, and author reports and do the technical work themselves. A senior consultant is then the minimum grade for reviewing other people's work or for managing a more complicated project or for leading negotiations with building control.
Yeah.
Beyond that, there was then principal consultant, which was somebody with many years' experience, and the hierarchy wasn't entirely consistent after that due to the policy changing over the years, and people who got grades under one policy then not changing their grade when the policy changed. So the general rule was then the office managers were associates,
Yeah.
and above that there was a general manager.
Yeah. And one of the office managers at the time was Terry Ashton, is that correct?
I can't remember at what point in time the transfer occurred. In 2012, I think he was still office manager.
Yeah,
At some point, he stepped down from that role and handed it over to Andrew Wilmot.
yeah,
So certainly the earlier phase of my career, well, not for the first 2 weeks, I was line managed by somebody else who then left the company. But after that, and I say it must have been during 2012, Terry Ashton was my immediate line manager.
yeah.
After he stepped down from the role of office manager, and he was still an associate, still in the office.
Yeah.
But it was then Andrew Wilmot who took over the line management.
And would that have been during the time when you were still doing some, albeit limited, involvement in the Grenfell project? 2015, for example. By that
It
point?
must have been thereabouts. So
Yeah.
I do not recall the exact date of the transition.
Yeah. And just to be clear, you were based throughout in the London office.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Now, we know from your statement at paragraph 2.1 that you also served as an on-call firefighter in the local brigade while you were in Zurich.
No, that was not in Zurich. This was one in Switzerland.
Sorry, in Switzerland.
I studied in Zurich. I did not
Yeah.
live in Zurich.
I see. But
So it was a small town, 10 miles upriver from Basel.
that's where you...
That's where I was a firefighter, yes.
Great, yeah. And you say that parallel to your work as a fire safety consultant, since you've been in the UK, you joined Surrey Fire and Rescue Service in 2011.
Correct.
To serve as an on-call firefighter. Is that
Correct.
correct? Do you still
I do, yes.
perform that role?
I'm
Right.
still an active on-call firefighter.
Yeah. So is it right that you've got considerable first-hand experience of the behaviour of fires through that experience?
A certain amount. I mean, thankfully, we have less serious fires nowadays than you did 20, 30 years ago. So I don't have the experience that somebody may have had in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
Particularly not with the change of rules for furniture and domestic premises.
Yeah.
So I don't want to exaggerate my experience, but
No.
I have been in burning buildings under breathing apparatus before. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And we know that you left Exova in January 2016, and you tell us in your statement that you left and you became the fire engineering manager with the International Fire Consultants Limited. Is that correct?
Oh, that's my current grade. I started off in International Fire Consultants as a senior consultant,
Yeah. So you're still there.
but I'm still with International Fire Consultants. Yes.
Great. Now, just thinking back to your time on the Grenfell project, when you were at Exova, were you carrying out regular continuing professional development, CPD? Was that part of the regime within Exova?
At the time, there was very little formal CPD within Exova. They had a regime of regular training days and encouraging people to visit external seminars and whatever training appeared relevant at the time. The training budget was somewhat cut in 2008 during the recession, and the reinstatement of that budget was rather a slow process, should we say.
Yeah, I see. And can you recall anything that you did specific to external fire spread, any particular courses or CPD that might have been relevant to that
No.
around that time?
No.
And then prior to the Grenfell project, what experience did you personally have of overcladding projects as a fire safety engineer?
Anything to do with external wall design materials, I tended to pass over to colleagues in the certification division, so it's not something that I myself ever really gained a lot of experience with. I did work on a number of projects where questions rose up in external walls, and over time you do learn some things,
Yeah.
and pick up on some of the requirements. But if somebody had sent a set of detailed drawings to me and said, "Can you please assess these?" I would have passed them on to a colleague with much more specialist experience and knowledge in the field.
And those colleagues in the certification division, were they also based in London within Exova's offices there?
No, because some of them were based in Warrington. Some of them, because they did a lot of work on site, actually were, as far as I understood, officially based at home.
Yeah.
So those in the southeast of England, although they weren't notionally attached to the London office, they probably spent more time in London than in any other office.
Right.
But they tended to be at the other end of a telephone call than somebody would see face to face on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. And did you personally have any experience of residential high-rise overcladding projects before you worked on the Grenfell project?
Not that I can recall.
Now, I just want to then move to...
I mean, if I can qualify that, there were new build projects on residential high-rise where obviously the same technical requirements on standards for external walls apply. The refurbishment projects that I can recall in high-rise buildings were non-residential. So I've worked on high-rise residential, I've worked on refurbishment of residential, I've worked on refurbishment of high-rise, but I think Grenfell Tower was the first one that brought all three together in one project.
I see, that's helpful, thank you. So I want to ask you a little bit about your knowledge of international facade fires. As part of your work as a senior consultant in the fire engineering team at Exova, did you read industry journals at the time?
Probably not as much as I should. There was obviously I did spend some time reading. Yes.
Yeah. I believe there's a journal called Fire Protection Engineering. Did that ever?
That's not something I would have read regularly.
Do you know whether that journal covered large international fire outbreaks?
So not having read it regularly, I wouldn't.
No.
Wouldn't really have noticed.
Yeah.
I certainly was aware of that. External wall construction is a potential route for fire spread between buildings. I mean, there's obviously Lacanel House, where it's a known phenomenon there that the refurbishment and all the materials used during the refurbishment were part of an issue. Fairly close to the forefront of my mind would have been a fire in the outskirts of Paris in 2003, where there were similar issues. And I knew that those two fires weren't isolated cases. That, although they were probably the two that were the forefront of my mind. If you asked me to name any.
Yeah, you used the words there. I certainly was aware that external wall construction is a potential route for fire spread between buildings. There's a specific set of requirements, aren't there, about space separation
Correct, yes.
that are dealt with in the building regulations. Were you more generally aware, not just of those space separation issues, but of the potential for rapid external fire spread?
Yes,
up an
specifically
building?
citing the example of Lacanel House and that 2003 fire in Paris, absolutely.
Yeah. So as at the 31st of March 2015, I picked that date because we're going to come to an email that you drafted later in my questioning that's relevant to this. Were you aware that there had been a number of substantial fires in high-rise residential buildings with cladding on external walls?
Yes.
Yeah. And you've mentioned the Lacanel House fire. Did you know, for example, about the fire at Knowsley Heights in Liverpool in 1991?
That wasn't one that will have been at the forefront of my mind because I lived abroad when it happened.
Yeah.
I say that I was more familiar with this one in the outskirts of Paris because I happened to be living in France at the time.
Yes.
Than anything that happened in the UK specifically while I was living abroad.
Yeah. Or a fire at Garnet Court in Irvine in 1999.
Again, because I was living abroad at the time, that one, as much as I had heard that fires had occurred, that one wasn't at the forefront of my mind.
I understand, yeah. Were you aware of a spate of fires in the United Arab Emirates and in Dubai in particular?
Probably not in 2015. It's probably later when I became aware of quite how frequently there had been occurrences of fires of this nature.
So, for example, the Altair Tower in April 2012 or the Tanwheel Tower in November 2012. You weren't aware of those specific?
Certainly the names don't ring any bells.
Were you aware of a fire in France, in Mermot's Tower in Roubaix in France in May 2012?
It doesn't ring any bells.
No. And what about just moving forward in time to the fire in the La Crosse building in Melbourne in Australia in November 2014? Was that something that you were aware of?
I've got a vague recollection of hearing something of a fire in Melbourne, but I certainly didn't pay a lot of attention to it.
Yeah. But obviously you've said you had some general awareness of the issues. Did you think that these international fires, and indeed some domestic ones, were relevant to projects involving composite metal materials and external insulation? Was that an awareness that you had at the time?
certainly had an awareness that of the need to specify the appropriate materials. I mean, as for metal composites, if we're jumping to something here, but maybe to give something in context, when I wrote that email that I'm assuming you're going to refer to about the question of cavity barriers or fire stops, I was not aware that metal polymer composite rain screen panels exist on the market.
Yeah,
I just assumed that these panels were either metal or glass.
I see. So your awareness of other cladding fires hadn't resulted in an awareness that some of those fires had involved composite metal panels with a different
Correct.
composition core. Yeah,
Correct.
I understand. Were you aware that external wall systems needed heightened vigilance in terms of the risks that could be posed by them?
Yes. Yes.
Now, were you also aware that there had been guidance produced by the BRE, the British Research Establishment, concerning the hazards posed by exterior wall cladding systems in 1988, 2003 and 2013 in terms of BR 135? Were you aware of that?
Distinction here between 2012 and 2015. My awareness throughout the period while Exova was working on the project, my awareness grew. I read approved document B from cover to cover at the start of my employment at Exova. External walls weren't the subject I occupied myself with, to a great degree. So although I was aware that there were requirements, in 2012 I hadn't memorised, shall we say, what those requirements specifically were.
Yeah.
Round about 2014, we then had a number of queries come in from various directions about suitability of materials, most of them driven by insurers rather than by building regulators.
Yeah.
And obviously from that moment onwards, my awareness did increase.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, again, had anybody asked me, can I please confirm whether such and such a design is appropriate, as I said before, I really would have passed that over to my colleagues, rather than relying on my own knowledge of the subject.
Yeah, yeah. So we know that BR 135 is referred to in paragraph 12.7 of ADB.
Correct.
Let's just look at the second edition of that. This is the 2003 edition. If we can go to this at BRE 405554. Great. So this is fire performance of external thermal insulation for walls of multi-storey buildings. Do you think you had read this by the time you were working on the Grenfell project?
No, categorically I hadn't.
No. Okay, fine. So, and did you know in general terms that this guidance drew attention to the possibility of rapid fire spread in external cladding systems?
So not having read it, I didn't know what its contents were. I'd say when I first read approved document B, I'll have obviously seen the reference to BR 135.
Yeah.
But because it wasn't a subject that I really got very involved with, I didn't spend a lot of time trying to work out what exactly the technical specifications in BR 135 are and how they differ from the what tends to be referred to as the linear route.
Yeah, I follow entirely. I am going to just take you to a few passages in it because nevertheless, even if you haven't read this specific document, I'm just interested to know whether you were aware of the general risks, warnings that this document were given. So if you just bear with me on that. So let's start by looking at page 8, and I want to look at the bottom paragraph. So it states there, this guide provides a basis on which the external fire performance of external cladding systems can be assessed. It doesn't specify where this performance standard should be adopted. This is a matter for regulators and specifiers. And then it says, however, the performance standard set out could be adopted where the implications of rapid fire spread by way of the external cladding system are considered to be unacceptable, such as tall buildings above 18 metres that may be out of the reach of conventional firefighting techniques and areas where people sleep when external fire spread may present an unacceptable risk to the occupants. So just pausing there, thinking back to 2012, 2013, when you first were working on the Grenfell project, were you aware in general that guidance was drawing this distinction between lower-rise buildings and high-rise buildings
Yes, I
above
was. Yes, I
18
was.
metres?
Yes.
So you were aware of that?
Yes.
Okay. And then we're just going to look at a number of warnings that this guidance gives about the potential route for fire spread through multi-storey buildings. If we look at page 10, under item 3, there's a section there, a sub-paragraph. Can you see cavities?
Yes, yes.
So it says there, cavities may be incorporated within an external cladding system or may be formed by the delamination or differential movement of the system in a fire. If flames become confined or restricted by entering cavities within the external cladding system, they will become elongated as they seek oxygen and fuel to support the combustion process. This process can lead to flame extension of 5 to 10 times that of the original flame lengths, regardless of the materials used to line the cavities. This may enable fire to spread rapidly, unseen, through the external cladding system if appropriate fire barriers have not been provided. Do you see that there?
Yes, yes.
Now, just breaking that down, were you aware of the phenomenon of flame elongation?
Yes, I was.
Within a cavity?
Yes, I was.
You were. And were you aware of that regardless of the materials used to line the cavities?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you were aware of the potential for unseen rapid fire spread
Yes.
if
Oh, yes. Yes.
appropriate barriers
Yes.
haven't been employed?
Yes.
Yeah. And then if we can stay on that page, under item 5, in the last section, there's a heading, Fire Service Intervention. And it says there, where the external cladding system is not significantly contributing to the spread of fire from one storey to the, seems to be a typo, then intervention by emergency services should prevent continued fire propagation by way of the building envelope. But then it says this, however, where the external cladding system is contributing to the fire propagation rate, the potential exists for the fire to affect multiple stories simultaneously, thus making firefighting more difficult. So again, on that last point there, were you aware of the potential for external fire to affect multiple stories simultaneously?
That's precisely the situation that occurred at Lacanal House, or that fire in 2003 on the outskirts of Paris. So absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. And then if we can go on to page 17 within this document, under the heading, system-specific details. In the second to last paragraph, it says there, in the beginning, it says, once the fire is within the cavity, it may propagate unseen through the system if adequate fire barriers are not employed. This may result in significant risk of system collapse or fire breakout at significant distances from the fire origin. So again, focusing on that last sentence, was that something that you were aware of, this significant risk of system collapse or breakout significant distances from the fire of origin?
In as much as I was aware that that risk exists wherever there's cavities, rather than specifically in external walls. Then a cavity in an external wall in that context is basically the same issue as a cavity anywhere.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. And then at the top of page 18, just over the page, in the top paragraph, in the second to last and the last sentence, I want to focus on the bit that talks about metal panels. Mm-hmm. So it says there, metal panels such as aluminium may fall from the system if the strength of the fixings is affected by the local fire source. They may also melt, generating molten metal debris if exposed directly to the sustained flame envelope. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So just looking at those two sentences separately, were you aware of the potential for metal panels falling from the system?
Yes.
Yeah. And what about the melting and the generation of molten metal debris if those panels were exposed directly to the sustained flame?
Well, obviously, particularly aluminium with its low melting point would melt if attacked by flames, would melt quite rapidly. Had no knowledge of molten metal flowing any significant distance.
Yeah.
Images I had in my mind were more of the fixings failing and panels becoming detached.
Yeah.
And therefore large pieces of, I don't know if shrapnel's the right word, but certainly small or large pieces of, as I was assuming, solid metal rather than molten metal, not that I want to be hit by either.
Yeah, yeah, I follow, yeah. Now, the version of this BRE guidance, this BR 135 guidance, which was available for the majority of the period of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, was set out in the 2013, the third edition of BR 135. Can we bring that up? That's at CEL 403364. Now, can you recall, so this is the third edition there, we can see slightly grainy after the title, by Sarah Colwell and Tony Baker. Do you recall reading this at any time when you were involved in the Grenfell Tower?
Not while I was involved in
Okay.
working on the project, only after I'd left Exova.
So again, I just want to look at some of the warnings that were within this document, just to see if you're aware of the principles. Can we go to page 11 in this document? And at paragraph 2.1, in the third paragraph. So it's drawing attention to potentially conflicting requirements in terms of thermal performance versus fire performance. And it says this, at this paragraph, these potentially conflicting requirements are highlighted in the area of innovative materials and designs, which are being driven by the need to construct more energy efficient and sustainable buildings. In order to meet these design challenges, the range of new and innovative materials and designs of systems being offered as potential solutions has also increased. The volumes of potentially combustible materials being used in external cladding applications. In addition, these external wall cladding systems, while still widely used for refurbishment applications on masonry structures, are increasingly being applied to new build scenarios using lightweight framing solutions for the wall system. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, again, just taking a number of points from that, were you aware of there being the development of innovative materials driven by the need to construct more energy efficient and sustainable buildings?
How innovative is innovative. I wasn't keeping abreast of the developments. This paragraph mentions the challenge of improving energy efficiency and the potential conflict there between the fact that some of the most effective insulators are also combustible.
Yeah.
I was aware of that potential conflict.
Yeah.
Now, whether how much the word innovative really would have connected to any of my thoughts, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. Could I put it this way? I mean, and building on to the next point, were you aware that increased volumes of potentially combustible materials were being used in external cladding applications?
I was aware that insulating materials that were not of limited combustibility were being used. I don't know about any awareness of their increasing. Had I thought about it, well, yeah, it seems logical that with the concerns about global warming, well, of course, we're adding more insulation to buildings, and as a logical consequence, we will be using more insulating materials.
Yeah. Just thinking back at the time, you said you had an awareness that more insulating materials were being used that were not of limited combustibility. How did you gain that awareness? What was that from?
Difficult to say retrospectively.
Was it an awareness of BS 8414 testing having been done on full systems?
No, most of it will have been sitting in design team meetings with with project teams, where obviously it's not just my part of the project that focuses on. I mean, obviously part of that meeting will look at fire safety and other parts. And so there will be discussions about material selections. So I can't recall any specific conversation with any particular person on any particular project, other than I know that buildings need insulation ever since the oil crisis in the 1970s, if not before. And I was certainly aware that, that some of the insulating materials that are used are not of limited combustibility, and exactly how that awareness generated, I can't really recall.
Yeah, okay. So moving on within this third edition of BR 135, if we can go to page 19 and pick up at paragraph 3.6.2, there on the right-hand side. And if we pick up the fourth line, it talks about that there is the potential for fire to propagate throughout the system if adequate fire barriers are not installed. And it says, since a cavity is likely to be present behind the insulation boards in LFS, I think that's lightweight frame systems.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
It is important that this potential is recognised and adequate fire stopping is provided using fire barriers or fire stopping details to maintain the system's stability in the case of fire. So it's really drawing quite significant attention to the importance of this fire stopping or cavity barriers within these cavities. Again, was that something that you had an awareness of?
Absolutely,
at the time?
and this is one of the frustrating things. It's the hidden items of construction that very often are the most important, and the ones that are easiest to neglect and bodge.
Yeah.
Ms. Grange, just for the transcript purposes, it's actually paragraph 6.3.2.
Yes, sorry, what did I say?
You just gave an incorrect reference.
Oh, sorry, I thought I said 6.3.2. Sorry, I apologise. Can we go on to page 22 of this and look at paragraph 6.4.1? So that starts at the bottom of that page. If we could just move down. And the heading is performance of materials in fire, and there's a subheading insulation, and it says this: as it can be difficult to prevent fire entering the cavity and spreading in these systems, the selection of the insulation materials used and the design of the fire barriers to close these cavities are particularly important. Now, pausing there, were you aware at the time you were working on the Grenfell project how important it was to make sure the selection of the insulation materials was adequate?
In general terms, I mean, again, I didn't spend a lot of time immersing myself in questions about detailed design of external wall systems. So the general requirements and the risks, generally speaking, yes.
Yeah.
It's not something that it's specifically in the context of external walls that I spent a lot of time thinking about.
No, yeah. Just picking it up like one sentence further on in the sentence beginning once, it says, once the fire enters the cavity, the surface of the insulation materials is exposed to the fire source. The fire is contained within a narrow cavity, which will encourage elongation of the flame front, and so increase the potential for propagation of the flames through the cavity. And then it says, it is therefore essential to provide suitable fire barriers to protect these systems. So again, were you aware of this phenomenon that once the fire has entered the cavity, the surface of the insulation is then exposed to the fire source, and then that narrow cavity can be a source of fire spread?
Again, generally in the context of cavities, yes. I don't know that I'd spent a lot of time thinking about the issue specifically in the context of external walls, but I was very much aware of the issues of cavities generally speaking.
Yeah. Then if we can look in the right-hand column under 6.4.1, we might have to go back up to the top of that page. Under the heading External Panels and Finishes, at the end of that paragraph, we get another reiteration, metal panels may fall from the system if the strength of the fixings is affected by the local fire source. And then they may also melt, generating molten metal debris if exposed directly to the sustained flame envelope or other combustible materials in the system. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a development from the last piece of guidance. So, again, were you aware that there could be an awful lot of interaction going on in the external wall as between, the insulation, the metal panels, if there's sustained flaming in the envelope?
Again, in the context of cavities generally, it's sort of something I could have worked out for myself. Also, to repeat what I said earlier, my awareness of issues relating to external walls rather evolved over the period 2012 to 2015, and by 2015 my awareness was rather greater than it was in 2012.
Yeah. But just to be clear, you hadn't read this guidance?
I hadn't read that guidance, no.
2015, no.
I mean,
Yeah.
Had I read it then, I would not have been surprised at anything that's written there,
No.
if that's an appropriate way of putting it.
Yeah. Then just one final thing I wanted to look at in this third edition, under 6.4.1, this last paragraph beginning combustible panels. If we can just read that together. So it says combustible panels are typically based on vinyl or glass reinforced plastic, although various new products are being developed in this area, some of which also contain insulation materials. These products generally have good surface spread of flame characteristics to prevent rapid fire spread across the surface of the system, but once the panels become involved in the fire, they have the potential to generate falling debris, add to the overall fire load, and provide a route for fire to propagate up the outside of the building. So again, I think you said earlier that you weren't aware at the time of the development of composite panels. Is that right?
I think distinction needs to be drawn here between the sorts of composite panels that one typically finds on low-rise buildings, sort of rather cheaply constructed portal frames and the likes. So a structural sandwich panel, or a sandwich panel which is serving both to provide the structural rigidity and insulation.
Yeah.
They are a firefighter's absolute nightmare, and I'm very, very aware of those and the risks posed with those. Grain screen cladding obviously is a slightly different application. I was not aware of products on the market that were metal composite sandwich panels for that particular application.
Yeah.
So yes, I was aware that if you put a metal composite on an external wall, it creates risks, and therefore one must question the wisdom of putting such panels on the external walls of high-rise buildings. But I really was thinking more in the context of the insulation rather than the rain screen.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Just thinking back now to approved document B, I mean, you said you read it at the outset of your engagement with Exova. Were you aware in 2012, 2013 that approved document B also expressly warned in section 12.5 that the use of combustible materials in the cladding system and extensive cavities may present a risk in tall buildings? Were you specifically aware of that?
I'm not sure it's at the forefront of my mind. I mean, yes, I will have read it, and I was aware that materials on the external walls of high-rise buildings need to be correctly specified so as not to create unacceptable risks. Not sure it was at the forefront of my mind, I have to say.
Yeah, I understand. Were you also aware of a report from Exova Warrington Fire Australia on fire safety engineering design of combustible facades from December 2011?
Nope.
No. Okay, thanks. So just to recap, by March 2015, were you aware that cladding facades on high-rise buildings pose serious fire hazards for the safety of the occupants of such buildings?
Yes.
And were you aware that it's essential to have regard to those risks when assessing whether the cladding complies with requirement B4 that the external walls of a building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls?
That's fair to say that, yes.
Yeah. Now, we've touched already on the different kinds of cladding panels that were available in the UK around this time and your awareness. Did you have an awareness of composite metal panels in general being used for rain screen facades?
Not for rain screen facades, no.
No. And does it follow then that you didn't have an awareness of composite metal panels with a PE polyethylene core being used?
Again, not for that application. So if we're talking about a single store refrigeration warehouse, yes, not for this application.
Yeah. What did you know about polyethylene at the time?
It is a thermoset polymer, so it tends to melt and run away rather than just, in comparison with, say, Perspex, which tends to char and burn. Polyethylene will melt and burn.
Yeah.
But it certainly burns quite nicely.
Yeah.
And if you create a foam of it, well, that will obviously allow more air to get into it and rather accelerate their combustion.
Yeah. At the time, were you aware that PE was highly combustible?
Yes.
And that any panels containing such cores would exacerbate the spread of fire over external walls?
Had I imagined that such products existed,
Yeah.
I would have worked
Yeah,
out
I
that there is a great risk there, yes.
Yeah. And does it also follow from your answers that because you weren't aware that these products existed, that you also weren't aware that some of these cladding panels were available with FR, fire-resistant cores, which could be expected to perform better than other thermoplastic cores, for example?
I mean, it's, if somebody had told me, it's a logical conclusion that, yes, I was aware that plastics existed with fire retardants and of course, their performance is, I'm not going to say good, but probably less bad.
But it wasn't something you were specifically aware of, saying, well, this product manufacturer has a range of cores available and it does an FR core. And
No.
Okay, yeah. So moving to your role at Grenfell Tower, is it right that prior to that you'd been Exova's lead consultant on the CALC, the Kensington Academy and Leisure Centre project?
For the latter phases of that project,
Yeah.
not initially.
Yeah. From around the autumn of 2013, is that right?
Must have been thereabouts, yes.
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact date of the handover, but must have been thereabouts.
Yeah. I think that's what you say at paragraph 3.5 of your statement, yeah. And is it right that in relation to the Grenfell Tower project, your role involved reviewing issue 2 of the outline fire safety strategy that had been written by Mr. Ashton?
I think, say my role was, is possibly a misinterpretation of the situation. I didn't have any formal designated role within the team for Grenfell Tower.
Yeah.
It was more ad hoc provision of assistance to Mr. Ashton, who was the lead on that project.
Yeah, I see. And is it also right that you were called upon to review emails of a technical nature on an ad hoc basis?
Correct,
from
yes.
time to time? And we'll look at that in more detail later. Now, in terms of your role as a fire safety engineer, can I just take you to a publication we looked at with Mr. Ashton? This was the Fire Industry Association Guidance Note, which addressed the scope of works for the fire engineer. This is at INQ 30-11219. Now, in fairness to you, this document wasn't produced until May 2015. So it postdates your key pieces of involvement in the Grenfell project. But I'm just interested to know, first of all, when it came out, were you familiar with this document? Have you read it?
I must have heard of its existence. I can't remember at what point I first read it, but it probably wasn't immediately.
I see. It doesn't sound like you're hugely familiar with it.
I am in the meantime.
Okay, yeah.
But it's more due to having read it subsequently after having left Exova.
I see. Would you agree that this guidance note reflects good practice in the construction industry before and after 2012. So that what it's saying about the scope of work for the fire engineer is reflective of what would be regarded as good practice.
Generally, yes. Just one thing to bear in mind with this document, it is aimed at clients advising what they should specify the fire engineer to do, rather than aimed at the fire engineer telling the fire engineer what to do.
I see. If we can go within it, at the top of page 4, where it deals with the general section, we can see there that it states a couple of paragraphs about the fire engineer's overall role. I just want to ask you about this. So it says there, the fire engineer's overall role will be to provide advice in relation to the fire safety aspects of the design in order to provide reasonable confidence that the design that is developed, as well as the completed building, should achieve an acceptable standard of fire safety, comply with the client's objectives, and meet all relevant legal fire safety requirements. And I appreciate that's just a very general overview, but would you agree with that?
That's certainly
summary?
what we're trying to, although the services we're trying to offer a client, yes.
Yeah. And in the next paragraph, it says this: the fire engineer should coordinate with the design team in order to ensure that the other members of the team who are aware of any fire safety design issues relevant to their responsibilities within the project. Again, would you agree with that as a summary of the role of a fire engineer?
Again, looking at it from the perspective of this is a document aimed at potential clients, yes, it's what should happen. The degree to which the coordination occurs is very often dictated by the project managers and the client. Some clients are more proactive than others, and at times it can be quite frustrating if a project is poorly managed, whereas then others, if anything, you then get roped into lots and lots of work where actually there's nothing I can provide of benefit. You're just wasting your money asking me to sit in a meeting, and obviously the entire spectrum between those two extremes.
Yeah.
So, yes, obviously it is much more productive and also much more pleasant to work with a project team that invites you in for a very proactive coordination.
Yeah.
But the degree to which that coordination occurs will very much vary from project to project.
Yeah.
And precisely one of the reasons for this document, as I understand it, was to make clients aware of this need for coordination and how deeply they should involve a fire safety engineer in the team.
Yeah. I follow all of that. Would you agree, though, that the mindset of the fire engineer ought to be to coordinate with the design team? That should be the expectation and the intention, say, at the outset.
Coordinate with
Yeah.
the team, not coordinate the team.
No, coordinate with the design team. Absolutely.
I'm providing advice. I'm not ramming that advice down the client's throat.
Okay. And would you agree that in carrying out that coordination and working with the design team, your role is to try and ensure that the other members of the team are aware of any fire safety design issues relevant to their responsibilities within the project?
Yes.
You're there to try and educate them and
Yes.
alert them?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, just before we come to some more detailed examination of what you did on the Grenfell project, who did you understand the client to be on the project when you worked on it?
I had no understanding whatsoever. My understanding of the arrangements with Calc were somewhat confused. Pre-construction, as I understand it, the client was the Royal Borough of Kensington-Chelsea, who employed Studio E, and we were then a subcontractor to Studio E. Post or during the construction phase, we were then employed directly by the contractor.
Sorry, are you describing the Calc
For
project
Calc,
here? Yeah.
precisely.
Yeah.
In absence of any information to the contrary, I'd just assumed that the same arrangements were in place for Grenfell Tower.
I see. So, I mean, first of all, when you were involved in the Grenfell project, let's take when you reviewed issue 2 of the
Yes.
fire strategy, and then when you gave the advice to Mr. Ashton in March 15.
Yes.
did you have any active awareness at that time of who your client was? Did you engage?
I just by default assumed that our client was Studio E and their
Yeah.
client was the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea,
I see.
which in the meantime I know is completely wrong.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. So moving on then to the specific work you did, I want to look at three main topics now. I want to look at the peer review process within Exova. Then we'll look at your review of issue 2 of the outline fire safety strategy. And then I'm going to look at the ad hoc advice which you were involved in, including in 2015. So I want to take those three topics in turn. So in terms of the peer review process, I want to discuss with you the process by which team members at Exova review each other's work. And if we can start with technical emails or technical advice, let's look at paragraph 3.7 of your witness statement. This is at EXO 40157. Yeah, thank you. And 4 lines down in that paragraph, you're talking about a specific instance where you're asked to appraise some layouts. And then 4 lines down, you say, as a general rule at Exova, technical advice would not be sent to external clients without 2 people considering the advice. It was therefore not uncommon for Mr. Ashton to discuss technical queries with me or other senior consultants. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, to your knowledge, while you were working at Exova, was that practice of having 2 people considering technical advice, was that ever formalised in a written policy or procedure within Exova?
I mean, yes, there was a procedure for creating written technical work, which I did read when it was first produced. I didn't memorise it to the point where I could say one way or the other whether it's specifically related to the more informal communications or whether it was to reports. This requirement to get any emails counter-reviewed, this was something that was drummed into us verbally quite regularly in the office. I mean, it was made quite clear to us, and Terry Ashton, to his credit, was leading by example, and usually any email that he sent out, he would get, although he was the most senior person in the office, he would, as a general rule, get somebody to double-check it, and what I said is what I'm saying correct.
Yeah, okay.
And probably the leading by example is the stronger way of enforcing a policy than any written document.
Now, just to look at something else you say in your statement about this, at paragraph 4.5 of your statement on page 6, you also say in the last 3 lines, just picking it up, you say it was not uncommon for Mr. Ashton to discuss technical matters with other staff, as all email containing technical information had to be approved by at least 2 people, and this might explain my involvement. So you've reiterated the point there again. How did you understand the term technical information or technical matters to apply in this situation? What would count as a piece of technical advice deserving of a second?
Pretty much anything to do with the design of a building, contrasted to arrangements for the logistics of a meeting and dates for and locations for meetings, or contractual issues, scopes of work, and then probably also minutes of meetings. I mean, if the reviewer wasn't in the meeting, how do they know whether the minutes are accurate or not?
Yeah. So, but it sounds like you applied quite an expansive definition of when something was a technical.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if in doubt, err on the side of caution.
Yeah. Now, I just want to go to Mr. Ashton's statement at this point, at paragraph 5.31. This is at EXO 401621 at page 19. Now, he's discussing an email that we're going to come to later, the email of the 31st of March 2015. But for current purposes, I just want to focus on the fact that he appears to have sent an email to Mr. Crawford of Studio E before receiving an email from you on that topic in which you were giving advice.
Yeah.
So he'd sent an email, and then sometime after he received an email from you. Would you say that this is an instance where it was contrary to the standard practice for Mr. Ashton to respond to the query without another person?
I mean,
checking the
not knowing the
advice?
full circumstances and which that email, or he wrote his email, I couldn't say, but certainly appearances are that yes, this would be a non-following of that
Yeah.
general policy.
We're going to come to look at this in more detail. Can we look at another example that you refer to? This is at paragraph 3.7 of your witness statement. So EXO 401573 at page 3.
Mm-hmm.
And there you say this. I have a vague recollection about being asked to appraise the layout of the entrance area of the boxing gym in Grenfell Tower and its connection to the rest of the building, and particularly the requirement for fire doors. Possibly I was asked by Mr. Ashton to review an email he had drafted. And then that's where we looked earlier that you go on and explain that as a general rule it would have the second level review. I just want to ask you about that. I don't want to discuss the specifics of the advice you were given, but ask you a bit more generally about what you recall about the checking process that would happen in these circumstances. Using this as an example, how much information would you expect to be given, for example, before you would appraise the layout of an entrance area in a building like Grenfell Tower?
Oh, grief.
Would you expect to be given additional information, or would you expect to be able to deal with it on the face of the emails that say you and Mr.
It really depends on where we are in the design process. So, you may have an early concept design, even feasibility study, in which case it's some very rough sketch lines on a piece of paper. Later, as the design develops, you'll have more information. So the information you're given really depends on the context.
I see, yeah. But would you say that it was the practice within Exova, if necessary, to ask for contextual information around the issue so that you knew the basis on which you were advising?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at something and say, hang on, I don't quite get how this fits in, or there are situations, well, this is a classic case of where unforeseen consequences, can you please give me a bit more background context? Absolutely, I would ask for the additional information, where I felt that something I either didn't understand or there may be hidden risks lurking somewhere else.
Yeah.
And we all get the, never mind that, you've got a bigger problem over here that you need to pay attention to. That obviously occasionally happens.
Yeah, because I'm interested on the Grenfell project, for example, if we go back one paragraph to the page before, in paragraph 3.6, on the bottom of that page, you've explained there, because my colleagues were working on the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, as well as the close proximity of that project to Calc, I became aware of some isolated bits of information regarding the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. You see that there? So can you explain, in circumstances where you're only aware of isolated bits of information, can you explain how you were able to carry out the reviewing process competently?
Where I was asked to review something, well, yes, I would make sure that I've got all the information that I felt I needed. There are situations where you're in an open plan office, you're doing something and someone somewhere else is discussing something. You will hear of details about the project which have got no relevance to what you're then later going to be asked to do at all.
Yeah.
And then there's you're asked to do a specific task. Well, in that case, obviously, yes, you do ask for all the information that you think you might need.
Okay, yeah. So moving on then to the question of reviewing a report as distinct from, say, a technical piece of advice. Now, I think we know this from other witnesses, but it's right, isn't it, that at the time you were working on the Grenfell project, Exova wasn't certified under ISO 9001.
I thought we were, and I thought, but
I think others have said you were working towards it and you gained it.
I can't remember the details now. I mean, certainly the There was lots of discussions about ISO 9000 certification and policies were written.
Yeah.
Where we were in that certification
Okay.
process, I don't know.
Yeah, okay. At Exova, was there a documented procedure established which defined the controls that were needed to approve a report prior to issue?
Thinking back and not having refreshed my memory of those, what the procedures were, I couldn't tell you what the specific contents were.
Yeah.
There certainly was a procedure on report generation.
Yeah,
The exact details of its contents I can no longer recall.
yeah. And you can't recall whether that was a written procedure or something?
It was written.
It was written.
Oh, yeah. No, there was a whole
Yeah.
suite of written policies and
Okay.
procedures, but I cannot recall the details.
Yeah. And what about the reviewing and updating of, say, fire strategy reports? Was there a formal procedure that would be relevant to that?
Again, I can't recall how much detail was captured in the policies.
Now, you've helpfully explained for us in your witness statement, if we go to paragraph 3.9 on page 3 of your statement. So we just move on. Yeah. Here you've described the process of reviewing a report, and you've said that it, picking it up in the first line, it involves comparing what is written in the report with any floor plans provided and ensuring, 1, that the report is factually correct, 2, that it correlates with the plans, 3, that the approach taken is appropriate, for example, that the design is based on the appropriate design codes or any fire engineering analyses are based on sound principles, 4, that it is correct where the report says that there is compliance with the cited design codes, and 5, that the facts, logic and mathematics of any fire engineering analyses are correct. Do you see that there? Now, was that your understanding of the standard review process for reports issued by Exova?
I didn't in my mind really make any distinction between a procedure for reviewing a standard report and procedure reviewing any other document or something less formal.
Right.
Bearing in mind that if you give incorrect information in an informal email, it can have just as grave consequences as making a mistake in a report.
Yeah, yeah. The process you've described there of peer reviewing a report, do you think that that was commonly understood within Exova?
Yeah, I see no reason why it wouldn't have been.
Is it possible that the process that was followed for peer reviewing a report may have differed as between different Exova employees? Were you aware that people were doing different things?
Well,
at the time?
what do you mean by process? I mean, in terms of, some people will print the hard copy out and scribble notes on a hard copy. Some people will review it on screen, but...
No, it's more about the detail and whether you're, for example, just checking for obvious errors or whether you're doing what you describe here, which is a more thorough check to see whether the report is correct.
Certainly my understanding was that the understanding was fairly universal, that you are checking all the detail. I mean, at the end of the day, we need to make sure that the documents we're producing are correct. And we all know that occasionally when you're authoring a document, you make omissions, make mistakes, and therefore that it needs to go be double checked. So certainly my understanding was that everybody had an appreciation for the importance of the review process and the need to be thorough with it.
Yeah. Was there any commonly understood procedure for making amendments to reports?
I mean, in the sense that if the reviewer finds something in a report they disagree with, you would then discuss the matter on hand with the author until you come to a consensus about what the contents should be. The process via which that happens, well, that will vary from person to person. for some people, found it a lot easier to work off hard copies with handwritten notes. Other people were using track changes on an electronic document. So the techniques and the processes changed, but the basic rule, I think it's an unwritten rule rather than a written one, but if reviewer disagrees with the author, you work together to find a consensus as to what the wording should be.
Yeah.
And it doesn't go out until the report doesn't get issued until you reach that consensus.
Yeah, yeah. So how would you commonly have gone about notifying the author of any suggestions or amendments? How would you do that?
Depends on circumstances. At the time, it tended to be. I certainly worked a lot more on hard copies when reviewing than electronically. I mean, my techniques have evolved over the years anyway.
Yeah.
And it depends if I'm reviewing something that was authored by one of the Warrington or the Manchester office. Well, obviously my communications media will be very different.
Yeah.
From reviewing something authored by someone in London. The communication will be very different if I'm reviewing something that one of the more senior members of staff did than it would be for a graduate writing their first report where you're expecting it to be full of mistakes.
Yeah. And if you did have suggestions or amendments, would they usually be discussed with the original author?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And would those amendments usually need to be approved by the author, the original author,
Yes.
before the report issued?
Yes.
And was there any policy? You've talked about sometimes you might get a disagreement and you'd have to resolve that. Was there any kind of policy or procedure within Exova that you had to follow for doing that?
Again, I can't remember what the details were of the written procedures.
Yeah. If we look at paragraph 3.14 of Dr. Barker's witness statement, this is at EXO 401603 at page 4. She's indicated there in those first few lines, ordinarily, if I had any comments on the draft report, I would provide my comments by way of a manuscript markup and would discuss any queries with the author. Do you see that there?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you were explaining that sometimes that might be what you would do, print out a hard copy, make any comments in manuscript and then discuss them. Is that, would you say that description there was the standard Exova review process at around the time of the Grenfell project?
I wouldn't say there really was a standard because, I mean, again, if you've taken two extreme examples, if you've got a report written by a graduate who hasn't yet really developed the skills for writing a report, well, you may end up having to completely restructure it.
Yeah.
Which is a lot easier to do in an electronic format, or possibly saying, well, do this, this and this, and we revisit it. Whereas if it's then something that is almost perfect, give or take a few editorial and punctuation marks, well, there it might be easy to do it on paper. It really depends on, you choose your tools depending on the exact task at hand, which will vary from one report to another.
Yeah, okay. Now, before we leave this process, just a few more questions. Going back to paragraph 3.93 of your statement, this is on page 3. Yeah, thank you. So we looked at that list that you've set out there, and in the third line you have, in the third point, that the approach taken is appropriate, for example, that the design is based on the appropriate design codes or any fire engineering analyses. Now, thinking back to your work on the Grenfell project, can you explain what the appropriate design codes would have been? What would be the main codes you would be looking to when reviewing a fire strategy for a building like Grenfell Tower?
So mixed-use building with effectively public assembly and a block of flats, approved document B. I mean, basically, approved document B is the default. For blocks of flats, BS 9991 would be an alternative option, but because that is just blocks of flats rather than mixed-use buildings, it's not the appropriate code. And similarly, BS 9999 is then just the just the commercial, so it's not appropriate for that. There are some buildings to which approved document B is not applicable, hospitals, schools, but approved document B is the default, and it is a fairly, shall we say, primitive code, which is why it's so widely applicable. So, and also at times it's the easiest to use.
Yeah.
So it's the default to which you fall back to if nothing else appears appropriate.
Yeah. Did you consider at the time that the CDM regulations, the construction design and management regulations, were relevant to any review of a fire strategy for a building like Grenfell Tower?
Oh, I mean, my appreciation of CDM regulations has evolved over time. I couldn't recall how much appreciation I had for them in 2012. And if I did, it was probably in two contexts. One is fire safety during the construction phase, and then designing things so that they are maintainable, if I can put it that way. I'm not sure I would have had a wider view of it than that, particularly as obviously the CDM regulations have evolved themselves during the period that we're looking at.
Yeah. By preparing a fire strategy at the time, so let's think back to, let's say, 2013 when you reviewed Mr. Ashton's fire strategy. By preparing such a fire strategy, did you consider that you fell within the definition of a designer within the meaning of the CDM regulations at the time?
I can't recall how well evolved my understanding of the CDM regulations were at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, we are designers. How developed my understanding was at the time, I couldn't tell you. I just cannot recall.
Is it possible that at the time that wasn't something that you had an awareness of?
I don't think I'd given it much thought, put it that way.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to come on to a different topic. That might be
Is that a good time?
Moment for a break. Yes, perhaps till past.
Yes.
If that's okay.
Right. Good. Well, Dr. Pearson, we're going to have a break now until 11:30. I'm going to ask you to go with the usher in a moment, but please, while you're out of the room, don't talk to anyone about your evidence, and we'll resume again, as I say, at 11:30. For the benefit of those watching, if anyone wonders why we have quite such generous breaks, I can say that one reason is to enable counsel to consider and deal with questions that may be coming in from lawyers who are watching our proceedings from other locations. All right, would you like to go with the usher, please? Thank you. Foster 11, please. Thank you. Yes, well, I see you're back with us already, Dr. Pearson. You ready to go on?
Yes, I am.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. So I just want to pick up then on what knowledge you had of the fee proposal and scope of work for the Grenfell project. Were you aware of the fee proposal and the scope of work for the consultancy services at Grenfell Tower that Exova had agreed to do prior to getting involved in any detail on the project?
I don't think I ever read it until the aftermath while preparing for the hearing here.
Can we just bring that up for a moment? So this is TMO 1303885. So this is the fee proposal that was sent to Studio E on the 9th of May 2012. And then on page 2, we see at the top of the page, proposed scope of work. The planned fire safety work would be undertaken using the relevant design codes and will facilitate the progression of the design from RIBA stage C to RIBA stage F. Do you see that there? And is that common that Exova would undertake to facilitate the design work according to those RIBA stages?
No, actually. Our work more often was punctuated by planning applications, tender submissions, commencement of work on site. So actually, for most projects, I tended not to really think in terms of RIBA stages, as much as a planning application typically will be done with a RIBA stage C design. And so, yeah, then you're developing pre-construction of a DE, possibly F. From my recollection, the majority of our fee proposals actually were then headed pre-planning, post-planning,
Right.
rather than RIBA stage, X, Y, Z.
Yeah. But can I just check, were you aware of what the RIBA stages were at the time?
I was aware of stages sort of A to F. Because I didn't very often get involved during the construction stages. My recollection of what the individual stages were beyond F was rather hazy. I had access to a list, and so had anybody asked me to do something for a particular RIBA stage, I could have looked it up and reminded myself what it was.
Yeah.
But so most of our work really was, most of my work is at strategic level, which tended to be completed by the time you got to about RIBA stage E. Sometimes went into RIBA stage F. Anything beyond that was then a different department, really.
Right, yeah. We can see, looking on at this fee proposal, that under RIBA stage C, if you look at the second paragraph there, it talks about a preliminary fire strategy report would be produced which summarises the main fire safety issues for the project. Do you see that there? Mm-hmm. And then if we go to the bottom of that page and look at RIBA stages D and E, which are dealt with together,
Yep.
in the first paragraph there, it states work undertaken during RIBA stage C would be further developed during the approval stage of the project, where the work would ultimately involve the creation of a detailed fire strategy for the proposed development, which will be written in line with the requirements of the Building Regulations 2010. Do you see that there? And I just want to ask you about that difference between a preliminary fire strategy and a detailed fire strategy. Was that a distinction that you were familiar with in terms of your own working on projects?
Yes, with the caveat that there's no strict definition of what level of detail one provides in each. Typically, there's no such thing as a normal project because every project's different, but typically I'll be writing an outline strategy at the pre-planning phase and a full strategy or detailed strategy post-planning. And obviously, as the design develops, you add a lot more detail in. Particularly with the pre-planning phase, what I have found over the years, it's often disadvantageous to provide a lot of detail because there's a risk of a client focusing on details and missing the big picture and getting the fundamentals wrong. So at the pre-planning stage, let's focus on what's needed there, get the basic concept right, and then fill in the details as we go along. The actual level of detail will very much depend on the specific needs of the project. There's no rules written in stone as to what level of detail is required at any given stage. And it will very much depend on what information that the rest of the design team has produced.
Yeah.
It's obviously an iterative process. Usually the architect will come with a set of preliminary plans. We'll then say, well, if you want to do this, the consequences are such and such. That then goes back to the architect and mechanical engine and electrical services engineer, who will then come with proposals. So it's almost a ladder. We're working together, working our way towards the detailed design.
Yeah. Now, typically, I fully appreciate every project is different. Typically, how much difference would there be between the preliminary fire strategy, stay at stage C, and a detailed strategy, as we've got outlined here? Would they look like very different documents?
It varied greatly from one project to another. How much? There were some where actually the outline already contained possibly more detail than needed. There are some projects where the detail was possibly not that detailed. It really did vary greatly from one project to another.
Yeah. Would you expect that detailed fire strategy to include reference to key drawings?
I would expect any strategy to contain references to drawings. Now, again, what are the key ones and what are the detailed ones? That will very much depend on the specifics of the project. But I mean, at any strategy will be relating to a specific design.
Yeah.
And in order to ensure there's no confusion, then yes, you do need to refer to the drawings and which revisions of those drawings. Because otherwise you might find that you're trying to work or describe one particular iteration of the design, and which is not what the architect thinks you're talking about. Yeah.
Would they typically include key drawings with annotated overlays supporting the analysis in the text? So kind of extracts from drawings with some annotations on. Would you frequently see that in a fire strategy?
Again, varies. I mean, particularly in the earlier stages, it tends just to be general arrangement drawings. If you're getting into the level of detail of Rebury, then if there are, I mean, taking calc as an example, which is possibly the atypical one because we did get engaged by the contractor well beyond the pre-construction phase, where throughout construction various complications made themselves apparent, and so we were then asked lots of detailed questions, and all the relevant documentation, obviously, for that then had to be included in the list of references on which the fire safety strategy is based. So there is quite a lot of detail in there, specifics to do with connections between walls and floors and things like that. That was probably one of the more detailed ones, and an extreme example that's certainly at one end of the spectrum rather than the average.
Okay. Just staying with this page for a moment, looking at the bottom of it, we see a series of bullet points. It says the fire safety strategy for the building will consider the following items. And we can see there that the fourth item is determination of any external fire spread issues that there may be and the impact this may have on the architectural design. Do you see that there? And then fifth one, recommendations of compartmentation and structural fire protection standards. Was it your understanding that a fire strategy should typically cover those aspects, if relevant?
They are parts of the sort of standards, the default scope of work for a fire safety strategy, if I can put it that way. Yeah.
And I think it follows from that whole list that this fire strategy should be considering B1 through to B5, the functional requirements.
Normally, yes. I mean, any project, the requirements will depend on specific requirements. I've worked on projects for buildings abroad, and obviously then it's not B1 to B5, it's whatever the local legislation is. But normally in the context of design work or a design project in England, then almost invariably the building regulation or Part B of the building regulations will be at least part of what we're focusing on, and therefore it will be discussing B1 to B1 to B5.
Yeah, thank you. Now, moving on then to your review of issue 2 of the outline fire safety strategy. If we can bring that up, this is at EXO 401758. This is the first page. We can see it's dated the 24th of October 2013, and it's issue number 2. Do you see that in the bottom
Yes.
right-hand corner? And then at the top of page 2, if we can go on to that, we can see there the previous issue was the 31st of October, so almost a year before, 2012, and it's prepared, this issue 2 is prepared by Terry Ashton and reviewed by you, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Now, can you recall approximately how much time you spent on that task of reviewing the report?
Not from memory, no. I mean, obviously, the changes I made, there was the one paragraph I inserted. Beyond that, not a lot. So, we're not talking about hours and hours of work here. But specifically, no, I can't.
Okay. Can we look at EXO 401763? And I want to look at the top of page 2. So here I think we're seeing an email from Margaret Trenner. Is it right that she was an administrative assistant within Exova?
I can't say that I particularly like the job title, but that was her official job title, yes.
Oh, I see.
I don't know what's gone. Yeah.
But anyway, she's sending you at 15:40, subject Grenfell Tower, high importance. This is on the 24th of October. Hi, Tony, please can you review, please, for issue today? Do you see that there?
Yes.
So this seems to be her emailing you the report. And then you appear to send this on to Terry Ashton at 16:13 that day. Can we look at the middle of page 1?
Yeah.
So if you look there, and there's an email 16:13 in the middle of that page. Terry, I've added something, although if you think what I've added is too long and draws too much attention to the issue, feel free to shorten it. And then you say report with the aforementioned addition and a couple of editorial corrections attached. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So it would appear from this that you're sending the report at 16:13. Prior to that, we can see that you've sent an email that we'll come back to at the bottom of that page at 16:01. Sorry, Terry Ashton sent an email discussing the resi stair, etc. We'll come back to that in a moment. But based on those timings, in terms of when you've sent the report through and when you got the report, it would appear that it was 33 minutes after you got it that you sent it through.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't hours, correct.
Yeah. And did you feel at the time that time period was sufficient to peer review the report in accordance with that practice that we saw at paragraph 3.9 of your witness statement?
I mean, trying to recollect, I just, I haven't got sufficient of a recollection to really know what my emotions were at the time. I mean, obviously, 3:30 in the afternoon doesn't give me a lot of time before end of play to review it. I mean, there's a certain amount of urgency there. I must have appreciated that urgency at the time, but I've got no specific recollection of what my emotions were at the time.
Okay. Do you remember comparing what was written in the report with the floor plans that had been provided in relation to the project?
Not specifically. It's something that I always did, so I see no reason why I wouldn't have.
Yeah.
And precisely because, if you compare this revision 2 of the report with revision 1, one of the key changes was a complete rewriting of the description of the means of escape.
Yeah, we'll come to that.
And so I think, and if you just read that without the plans, it's difficult to work out what's going on because it was a fairly complex design. So I must have done, if for no other purpose than myself understanding what's going on and which stairs which.
Yeah. Just to be clear, prior to being asked to review this report, had you had any involvement in relation to the Grenfell project?
As I mentioned in my witness statement, there was an episode that I cannot recall in any great detail, that
Was this about the layouts, the floor
Terry
layouts?
put a set of floor plans in front of me
Yeah.
and asked me for my views in relation to the protection of the means of escape from the boxing gym.
Yeah.
It was something to do with locations or specifications for doors. I cannot recall the details,
Yeah.
but it was at that point in time that I became sensitised to the fact that we have a shared means of escape
Yeah, I
between
see.
the gym and the flats, which must have been the reason why this was at the forefront of my mind while I was reviewing the report.
Yeah. Now, there's two drawings that are mentioned on page 4 of the outline fire safety strategy. If we just look at these, this is EXO 401758, page 4. We could just blow that up. This
Yeah.
is the introduction. And at
Yeah.
the end, it says it's based on discussions with the design team. And then there's fire access and fire strategy drawings, and 2 are named there. Do you recall whether you looked at those drawings as part of your review?
I'd say I must have done. I've got no specific recollection, but I struggle to imagine that I would have read the report without looking at those drawings.
Okay. And did you ensure during that time that the report was factually accurate? Was that what you were attempting to do?
That's what I was attempting to do.
Can you recall what you did to try to ensure that the report was factually correct? What steps did you take to check that?
Well, possibly, first of all, to not answer the question, my focus must have been on the parts of the report that changed rather than the parts of the report that remained the same.
Yeah.
That's the only way I can explain some things that I should have picked up on that didn't, such
I
as...
see.
So the focus must have been on the parts of the report that had changed and taking on trust that the previous issue had been entirely correct as far as the matters to which it pertained.
Yeah.
So most of the text I was concentrating on, the facts that were being presented, almost all relate to the configuration of the layout of the building. So the checking of those is synonymous with the comparing of the text and the description with the information on the drawings.
So does that mean that you were predominantly focused on the means of escape provisions within
I must
that
have
report?
been. I must have been.
Now, the other checks that you said you routinely did in your statement for reviewing this kind of report was to ensure that the report correlated with the plans. Did you do that?
Yeah. Again, obviously, I say obviously. Again, I've got no detailed recollection of my actions, but from my normal procedures, I cannot imagine that I reviewed that report without looking at the plans.
Did you actually? You also say you would look at the design codes and standards that would be appropriate. Did you have to look at any design codes or standards? Did you go to any during the course of this review?
The code on which this is based is approved document B, and for reasons already mentioned, there was complete unanimity within the office that was the appropriate code.
Yeah. But do you actually have a memory of looking at approved document B while you were doing
Not while I'm reviewing
this
that,
review? No. You said you'd also routinely ensure that the facts, logic and mathematics of the fire engineering analyses were correct. Was there anything of that nature that...
The only thing you could call a fire engineering analysis was the one I inserted, so there's nothing there to be checked.
Okay. But you did all of that within just 33 minutes, yeah?
Well, I said, bearing in mind that A, it's a very brief report, and B, the facts and logic, it was largely those facts almost all pertain to the drawings. So reading the text of that length, comparing it with the drawings, is not a massive not a massive number of man hours required for that.
Yeah. Now, I want to look at the amendments to issue 2 of the fire safety strategy. We've discussed in general terms the process for making arrangements already today, but let's look at the specific amendment that you made. If we can look at page 6 within the fire strategy and section 3.1.1, it's in the middle of that page. It's the largest paragraph there.
Yeah.
So is it right that you inserted these words, while the sharing means of escape between residential and non-residential accommodation is not endorsed by current statutory guidance, these proposals represent a continuation of the existing principles for means of escape in the building and therefore do not create a non-compliance with the requirements of the building regulations. It is noted in this context that the fire loads in the offices and boxing club are no greater than those in a typical flat, and that the non-residential accommodation will be separated from the stairs by ventilated lobbies, see below. The risks the occupants of a flat from a fire in a non-residential demise are therefore not considered significantly greater than those stemming from a fire in another flat. So those were your words that you inserted when you reviewed the report. Is that right?
Correct.
And I think you explain in your statement inserting that, and you explain that you inserted that because it didn't comply fully with modern design guidance. Which modern design guidance are you referring to there?
Primarily approved document B, but I mean any applicable design code, so it doesn't matter if you're using BS 9991 or anything. Whatever approach you would take, the recognised design codes do not endorse that situation.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not something that you would be allowed to do under the building regulations as they stood in 2012.
Yeah.
For a new build.
Yeah. And you say at paragraph 3.12 of your witness statement, perhaps we can just bring that up just to orientate ourselves there and see what you say. This is EXO 401753. You explain the change I proposed to the report was based upon my understanding of the existing means of escape. And then you say, and was made in the context of Regulation 3.2 of the Building Regulations 2010, which states that an alteration to an existing building is only material for the purposes of the regulations if it creates a non-compliance with the relevant functional requirements, the design standards, or if a non-compliance already exists, it creates conditions that are less satisfactory than before. So that was your understanding of the building regulations and
the relevant provisions of the building regulations. Obviously, the building regulations cover a lot more than fire and a lot more than alterations to existing buildings.
Absolutely.
But the bit of them that was relevant in this context.
Yeah. And then at 3.13, you say that the amendment was intended to indicate that while the addition of the boxing gym was not in line with standard guidance due to the mixed use, conditions were not being made worse by this alteration, and therefore it did not amount to a material alteration. And moreover, that in fact the risk to occupants was not significantly different from the risks in a typical block of flats without a gym. And then you say this is due to the fact that the fire load in a boxing gym would be unlikely to be higher than that in a typical flat. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have your explanation there. And then paragraph 3.15, you refer there to an email that you received on the evening of the 24th of October, expressing, from Mr. Ashton, expressing concern about the amendment that I'd made to section 3.1.1 of the report. And you say, I've only a vague recollection of this email conversation. Have you, in advance of giving evidence, been able to look over those emails and remind yourself of that conversation?
I've had a chance to reread them, yes.
If we can go back to that chain of emails, this is at EXO 401444. And we look at the bottom of page 1. So at 1553, we see at the bottom of that page that you wrote, Terry, I note that there's a stair which is shared between residential and non-residential parts of the building. And then if we go over the page, you've said, do we need to flag this up as a deviation from the standard guidance and provide a comment to the effect that the risks to the occupants of the flats from a fire in the boxing gym are no greater than those from a fire in another flat and or include compensatory measures. Cheers, Tony. So you're flagging to Mr. Ashton that you think you may need to draw attention to this deviation and explain the justification for it.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we go back to page 1, we see that Mr. Ashton replied at 1601, Tony, this is an existing situation whereby the resi stair, does he mean residential there?
He must do, yes.
Yeah. Whereby the resi stair is shared with other uses. If you feel that it would help, feel free to insert some text, but if you do, bear in mind that the escape route from the resi is shared with both the boxing club and office accommodation. Terry. And we can see that that's sent from his iPhone. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
So would appear to potentially be, well, on his iPhone somewhere, and he's sent that back to you. And then 12 minutes later, as we've seen, you reply at 1613 saying, Terry, I've added something. Although if you think what I've added is too long and draws too much attention to the issue, feel free to shorten it. And then you attach the report with the aforementioned addition. Now, just focusing there on that email,
Yep.
why do you say there draws too much attention? So you say, if you think what I've added is too long and draws too much attention to the issue, feel free to shorten it. Can you explain why wouldn't you want to draw attention to the issue of a non-compliance with current statutory guidance?
The report is, or was until I added my paragraph, totally focused on the requirements of building regulations and the discussion of building control as to whether the alterations complied with the requirements. Whereas what I was putting in there is more a flag to whoever's doing the risk assessment in the context of the regulatory reform order to be aware of the fact that there's something here that is not code compliant. What I'm trying to say is that we do not feel that the building is so safe that we should be altering it or closing it down, irrespective of the refurbishment works, and that it's in its current state it is not safe enough to continue to be operated. But precisely because this potentially detracted from the primary purpose of the report, which was the validation of the design of the alterations for the building regulations, that it might potentially draw attention to things to which attention did not need to be drawn.
I see. So the deviation from the current design guidance that you'd referred to, were you not referring there principally to paragraph 2.51 of ADB that talks about you can only share a stair?
I can't remember the paragraph number off by heart. I mean, it's a fairly universally accepted rule, not just in approved document B, but all the other relevant design codes.
Yeah.
So I say I wouldn't have been able to tell you at the time what the paragraph is.
No,
I
but
just
you
know
knew
that there is a
yeah.
that this is something that the authors of these codes are quite rather disquiet about.
I see. But I think you've just said that as well as flagging up the non-compliance with approved document B, you also intended to flag this up because of the responsible person's obligations under the RRO.
Precisely. This is primarily a flag in the context of the fire safety order, where I'm trying to say that the building in its existing state is, or we do not feel that building in its existing state is so dangerous that remedial action needs to be done with this issue, irrespective of what may or may not be going on elsewhere for the and what the scope of the refurbishment work is.
Yeah. Just going back to the language you've used there about whether it draws too much attention to the issue, I just want to put to you that wouldn't you want to draw attention to it to ensure that an alternative proposal is put forward which ensures there's equal or better compliance with the building regulations?
I mean, obviously, the fact that I raised it, I do want to draw attention to it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I say the purpose of the report was to discuss the design in the context of the building regulations compliance for these alterations. And there was no reason why this existing situation that was not being amended had any bearing under the building regulations, and I wasn't wanting to overly complicate the negotiations for the building regulations approval because of this pre-existing issue.
Yeah. Now, just at this time, we know later in the evening you got an email from Terry Ashton, but at this time when you'd flagged this, did you have any parallel telephone calls or discussions with Mr. Ashton about this? Do you recall?
A, I don't recall, and B, from the fact that everything is the wording of that email would imply that I didn't.
Yeah.
Now, the whole reason why this conversation occurs by email is precisely because he was not available on his phone.
Yeah.
Well, I cannot recall the reasons why.
If we go a little further up the chain to the next email up from 1613, we see that what you've done there is at 1653, so a bit later, after you've sent him back the report, you've just flagged in that email the text that you've inserted.
Mm-hmm.
So can you recall, why did you send that second email setting it out?
I'm afraid I can't, no.
Were you concerned that Mr. Ashton might not have opened the report you attached and read your change?
I was certainly trying to make it as easy as possible for him to satisfy himself that with the appropriateness of the text I'd inserted.
Yeah.
As I say, the exact ins and outs of the context and what conversations were going on, I cannot recall.
Okay. Now, Mr. Ashton was clearly unhappy with your amendment at the time, wasn't he?
Yes.
He responds at the top of this page. This is at 1747 that same day. And he says this, Tony, I told Mags to send the report out without reading what you'd added. Had I been able to read it, I would not have agreed to the amendment, as what you've said highlights the non-compliance with codified guidance, but more importantly is debatable. Let's hope that Paul Hanson doesn't pick up on it. Terry. Mm-hmm. Do you see that there?
Yes, yes.
What did you understand at the time when you were reading that about Mr. Ashton saying that the amendment was debatable?
The justification I've put for allowing this non-compliance with standards to persist is very qualitative and is precisely based on an argument that was not accepted by the authors of Approved Document B, because if it had been, that Approved Document B would have allowed this sort of configuration. The part of my thought process there was probably, this is a, and I'm guessing part of it I must have had in my mind that the pressing time frame of trying to get that report issued, in half an afternoon. This is something rather quick and easy that I can put in. Should it raise questions and building control then question it or ask for further justification, we can provide that at a later date.
Yeah, I see. That's helpful. So basically saying it's your justification for the non-compliance is what's debatable.
Yes, I mean the argument that the fuel load in the boxing gym, or we can rely on the fuel load in a boxing gym being low, that's certainly something that would not be universally concurred with by the rest of the fire safety community.
Yeah,
and I must have been fully aware of that at the time.
Yeah,
and from memory, what I think my thoughts must have been, well, I'll put something in there, a first attempted justification.
Yeah.
If building control comes back and says we're not happy with it,
yeah.
well, we'll revisit it.
Yeah.
But the fundamental attitude had to be, well, if the building's unsafe, then the fire brigade should have put an enforcement notice on it before we start talking about the refurbishment. The fact that they appear to be happy for the building to continue to be operated would suggest that there's a general consensus that although it is not code compliant, the risks in the context of the regulatory reform order are tolerable,
Yeah.
bearing in mind that design standards for existing buildings for the purpose of the regulatory reform order tend to be lower. I mean, the benchmarks and thresholds tend to be lower than the standards that you would accept from a new build structure today.
And that explained in your mind, does it, or did it at the time, that because your justification was somewhat debatable, that's why he then says, let's hope that Paul Hanson doesn't pick up on it?
Well, there's more background to it than, I mean, first of all, I suspect as much as anything else, Terry was annoyed with himself for having sent the report out without having checked my wording and had that discussion that he should have had. Terry had been in the business of fire safety, obviously, for decades. He'd been in the business since before I was born. He knew the senior building control officers and the fire safety engineers within the building control departments in the central London boroughs quite well. And I suspect any reference to Paul Hanson was due to his specific relationship with Paul and experience of Paul being somebody who was relatively pedantic.
I see.
I can possibly add that different boroughs in London had varying cultures in their building control departments. Some were a lot more willing to accept justifications for non-standard solutions than others.
Yeah.
And Royal Borough Council in Chelsea, their building control department had a bit of a reputation of being particularly hard to convince to accept anything non-standard.
Now, thinking back to the time when you received that email, were you troubled by Mr. Ashton's approach in what he said to you there?
Troubled's not the right word. I mean, obviously, it came as a bit of a smack, like, oh, whoa, what's going on here? And I've given you every opportunity to review the text and comment on it. It's a bit late now, but I don't know, so I mean, there's obviously the brusqueness of it, I think, must have put me back a bit, but no more than that.
Did you feel at the time that you were being reprimanded by him? Put back in your box, that, you know?
I can't remember exactly what I thought, but I mean, obviously by that time I'd worked with Terry for 5 years already. I knew that at times he can be a bit gruff, but it was one of these, well, let's wait till the morning and let's wait and see.
Yeah.
By which time apparently he'd calmed down and I don't think anything was ever said of it subsequently.
Were you concerned that his whole approach appeared to be not to draw attention to debatable points like that, not to draw attention to non-compliance with current codes, and hope that building control didn't pick up on it? Did you have any concerns about that approach at the time?
Not really. I mean, as I said, he'd been in the industry since before I was born, and he knows Paul Hanson quite well. So I trusted him to know his business better than I knew it.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the justification given for the non-compliance in the wording that you used, and I appreciate you said you were under time pressure to get this drafted, isn't part of the reason why approved document B doesn't recommend mixed-use accommodation sharing a single exit because the risk of fires breaking out in non-residential accommodation is much higher? In general terms.
Yeah, what do you mean by the risk of it breaking out much higher? The issue is not the likelihood of the fire. The issue is the potential for a fire to be large and to threaten fire spread to wider parts of the building and to jeopardise the escape routes. In any building there is always a residual risk. By nature of the fact that we allow blocks of flats to exist, we accept that there is a residual risk of a flat fire may break out in a flat and may lead to some compromising of the means of escape. We control that risk as best we can with appropriate fire doors, compartmentation, etc., etc., etc. But there's never 100% safety. The codes recognise that commercial accommodation, if I can use that word, is potentially harbours greater fire risks, and therefore, if a fire breaks out, there is an increased risk of compromise and means of escape from the flats than there would be from a fire in another flat. Possibly I can add at the time my thoughts there was, well, the approved document B is a fairly blunt instrument. lumps types of accommodation and different purposes together in fairly broad categories. So an intelligent, nuanced approach or a review of what are the actual risks might be able to justify something that just the broad brush purpose group categories of approved document B don't.
Yeah.
If they just say, well, it's public assembly, the contents could be anything, and the content of the theatre set, it's the same purpose group and potentially massive fire loads. So,
Did you feel at the time when you were writing it that your mitigation had adequately addressed the risks that were posed?
I was satisfied at the time that the risks were such that we didn't have to close the building as it stood at the time,
Yeah.
despite the fact that the pre-existing conditions did not comply with that guidance. Whether my explanation as to why I was satisfied with the conditions were sufficient to satisfy a building control authority, I don't know. Okay, to put it to the building control authority, some were more willing to accept a qualitative argument. Others would have required a detailed mathematical analysis. I didn't know what to expect from Kensington and Chelsea in this particular instance.
Yeah.
So a case of, well, put something down there, and if they reject it, well, we'll
Think again.
provide a more detailed analysis if required.
Okay. At the time, were any design risk assessments done which underpinned the assessment of mitigation? Was that a process you thought about undertaking, doing some kind of design risk assessment to weigh the pros and the cons?
Nothing formal.
Okay. Now, in due course, we're going to look a bit more at the content of issue 2 of the fire safety strategy, but I just want to stick for a moment with these changes. And I want to look forward to issue 3 of the outline fire safety strategy. We know that there was a draft of that on the 5th of November with yellow highlighting showing the changes. And then the final version is at TMO, if we could bring up TMO 208283999. You got that? TMO 208283999. Yeah. So this is the final version of issue 3, dated the 7th of November. And if we can go to page 6 under the heading Means of Escape. And then, so this, we can see there's that paragraph, Means of Escape General. So this contained similar wording, save that some of what you'd written had been deleted. And in particular, there was a phrase that had read, these proposals represent a continuation of the existing principles for means of escape in the building, and therefore do not create a non-compliance with the requirements of the building regulations. That phrase has been removed, and we have a smaller paragraph here. Now, I want to ask you, this fire strategy was written by, this 3rd issue was written by Mr. Ashton and reviewed by Mr. McElhaney. Was he aware, when he did his review, that you had made an amendment to issue 2 to add in this paragraph?
No idea.
You don't know? Did you ever discuss that with Mr. McElhaney?
I don't think I did. I mean, put it this way, I don't see any reason why he... Well, no, that's not true. He was obviously the reviewer of issue 1.
Yeah.
He was the reviewer of revision 3. There was a fair lapse of time between revision 1 and revision 3. So how good his recollection was of the contents of issue 1, of revision 1, and the change between what he reviewed and what he was now being given to review, I don't know. Certainly, I don't recall having any conversations with him at the time.
So you didn't ever discuss with him that you had added wording to issue 2, drawing attention to
I don't think I did.
non-compliance.
No. I don't think I did.
Do you agree that it would have been helpful for him to have known that when he was reviewing issue 3? It is only a few days later, that it would have been helpful for him to have known.
Possibly.
Can we look at your witness statement again? This is paragraph 3.20 of your statement. This is EXO 401753 at page 5. And you say there both issue 3 and 3B contain the same language in relation to the mixed-use issue identified above, which differed slightly from issue 2. In particular, omitted my earlier comment that this did not create a non-compliance with building regulations. It continued, however, to note that the plans involved mixed use of the staircase and that this was not in line with guidance at the time, but that the typical fire loads would be no greater and that the non-residential accommodation would be separated by ventilated lobbies, so the risks to occupants were not considered significantly greater. Do you see that there?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you say there, I think, that it's not uncommon, or you've said that it's not uncommon if a report's been previously reviewed and minor changes have been inserted, for someone to be asked simply to review those changes rather than necessarily repeating the full review.
Correct.
Again, was that something that was spelt out in Exova's quality assurance processes, that you could just review the changes and not review the report as a whole?
As per my previous answers, I cannot recall the details of the written policies and procedures.
But your understanding was that was a common practice, was it, within
My
Exova?
understanding was that it was a common practice of when somebody was reviewing a revision of a report, that they might just be reviewing the changes and taking it as read that the bits that weren't changed were as they should be.
I see, yeah. And then at paragraph 3.21, you say, I do not recall having discussed with Mr. Ashton the reasons why the text of issue 2 of the report was changed, but am happy that the revised wording in issue 3A and 3B adequately highlighted the point and reached the correct conclusion. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So I think you agree that words were removed from
Yes.
the paragraph.
No, they clearly were.
Were you aware of this at the time, that issue 3 was going out?
I don't believe I was. I don't believe that I ever did see issue 3 at the time when it was issued.
I see. That was my next question, is whether you saw issue 3 when it.
I doubt it. I mean, I have, in preparation for the hearing today, I've actually checked my diary for the date on which it was issued, and that particular day I was out of the office.
Yeah.
So I conclude there that no, I did not see it.
Yeah. Do you agree that in principle it would be better to highlight the potential non-compliance in the fuller way that your revision 2 did? I mean, revision 3 does draw attention to the non-compliance, but your language talks specifically about whether it does create a non-compliance with the building regulations. Your language is clearer, isn't it?
I mean, my general approach to writing strategies for existing buildings is somewhat different from Mr. Ashton's, and as much as I would generally start with a description of the building as it is and the state of the fire safety provisions in it, before then going on to explain what's being modified and what impact the modifications have on fire safety and the ins and outs in the context of the building regulations. So this is very much a Terry Ashton report, not an Anthony Pearson report. But as I said before, he'd been in the business since before I was born, so this report was very much, as I understood it, targeted to the specific needs of a specific project in a specific, or under the jurisdiction of a specific building control authority. And I didn't really see any reason to question his approach.
Okay. So pausing there, you've just said that my general approach to writing strategies for existing buildings is somewhat different from Mr. Ashton's. And you've said that you would generally start with a description of the building as it is, the state of the fire safety provisions within it, before then going on to explain what's being modified. How was Mr. Ashton's approach different from that?
This is very much focused on the validation of the changes in respect to Part B of the building regulations, and anything that's pre-existing and not being altered is not, is generally not mentioned at all, and I can only presume that is deliberate.
And that reflected a general practice of Mr. Ashton's as distinct from your practice, did it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, with the caveat that every report, again, is tailored to the needs of the specific project.
Yeah.
And depending on who the client is and the technical knowledge and abilities of the client. I mean, if you're writing a report, if your client is the owner of a building, you might need to adapt to things in slightly more layman's terms than if your client is a mechanical and electrical services engineer.
Yeah. You've talked a couple of times about how experienced Mr. Ashton was, his extensive experience in building control before coming to Exova. Did you feel in practice that it was difficult to question him?
No.
So you didn't feel somehow that it was harder to question him because he'd had such a length of experience and expertise in...
I mean, obviously, it is always going to be harder to question somebody with 40 years' experience than it is a graduate with 4 years' experience. And I had a lot of respect for him, and so possibly there was a tendency at times to think twice, and very often when I disagreed with him, it turned out that he was right and I was wrong. But that didn't stop me from questioning him. No, I mean, precisely because he was usually quite religious with getting all of his documents double-checked, including fairly minor innocuous emails where you think, that really is a statement of the obvious, why are you wasting my time reviewing it? Answer, because he's leading by example.
Yeah.
He precisely was somebody who very much practiced this requirement of making sure that everything was double-checked.
But what about others within the office? I mean, you've obviously got some academic experience that we discussed earlier in relation to fire behaviour, etc. Do you think others take Mr. McElhaney, who's reviewing this third issue, do you think it would have been difficult for him to have challenged Mr. Ashton if he disagreed with him, and that there was a level of deference to him because of his level of experience?
I think probably, if anything, if there was anything, bearing in mind that, yes, Mr. McElhaney was relatively inexperienced, if there was anything, it was probably self-doubt on the part of Mr. McElhaney. Not having the experience, not having seen as wide a range of different strategy reports to have as good a judgment as I like to think I've got as to what's good, what's bad, and what's ugly.
Right, yeah. If you'd known at the time that it was Mr. McElhaney who was reviewing the third issue of the report, do you think you would have thought that was odd, given his relative junior status?
I certainly would have thought it was odd, the general rule was no, you would give it to somebody more senior. I can only imagine that this was a breach of normal protocol due to the urgency of needing to get something issued.
Yeah.
As I say, to repeat my earlier thing, on that particular, subsequently checked, on that particular day, I was not in the office, and I would presume that had I been in the office, or had it been a choice of myself and Mr. McElhaney, that Mr. Ashton would have given it to me.
Yeah.
And not to Mr. McElhaney.
Yeah. You go on, I was just about to touch on that. You go on at 3.22 to deal with this. You say you're not aware of the reasons why he was chosen to review it, but would note that whenever there was a need to issue a minor amendment to a report urgently, the choice of reviewer was often dictated by who was available in the office at the time. And then you say, I don't recall who was available at the time. Can you explain why that was, that the choice of reviewer was often dictated by who was available in the office at the time?
Precisely as it says. I mean, if there's nobody else available, well, then if the entire staff is out of the office on meetings, well, I'm not available to review it, and so.
But was it ever discussed within Exova that perhaps a more formal process ought to be adopted for important documents like these, fire strategies?
I mean, this was very much the exception rather than the rule of giving it to somebody as junior as Mr. McElhaney to review. So this will only have been done as needs must. This was certainly not normal practice. And was really only accepted because Mr. Ashton was so experienced, and so because everybody in the within the firm had sufficient trust in him to actually get things right.
Yeah. So are you saying that normally the choice of reviewer would be a more considered process?
Yes. Yes.
And time built in to allow for the review process so that it's not being done at the last minute? Would that have been the normal practice?
Ideally, yes.
Yeah, but that didn't happen here.
That's the only conclusion I can draw.
Well, we can see it didn't happen in relation to issue 2 because you only got a few minutes to review it, and it would appear that Mr. McElhaney may have been chosen because there was no one else available. So am I right in thinking that it would appear that for the Grenfell project, these 2 fire strategies didn't follow a considered process for the review?
Well, the revision 2, possibly, the review was possibly rushed. Yes, the revision 3, well, I mean, I'm not sure that considered is a very precise word, but it probably wasn't as considered as one might ideally want it to be, if I can put it that way.
Well, I'll put it to you, a formal process which involved someone more senior reviewing it.
No, it certainly wasn't that, no.
Yeah. Just briefly before we come to looking at a little bit more at the content of issue 2 and what you were reviewing, just to explore a little bit your attitude to building control and building control approval. Can we just look at an email? This is SEA 30/12189. This is the top of the page. So this is Neil Crawford to Terry Ashton on the 20th of November 2014, copying in a number of others. And he says this, Terry, I've received these markups from Building Control regarding the fire strategy on Grenfell Tower. I am due to meet with them on Monday on site and wondered if you had any views on their comments. On the Academy project, we had the situation where Tony Pearson managed to argue some of their comments away. If you had any observations, particularly where you think their comments may be excessive, I would be grateful to know, as I can take these with me to the meeting on Monday. Regards, Neil. Do you see that there? Now, I'm not suggesting you were aware of it at the time. You're not copied into it. But I want to ask you about the comment there that on the Calc project, you'd managed to argue some of the building control comments away. Do you know what they might be referring to there on the Calc project?
Without going having access to the minutes of the meetings and the reports, I cannot recall in detail. Certainly, we did have discussions during meetings with representatives of the Royal Borough, Kensington and Chelsea, and there were some aspects of the design that originally they weren't convinced of, that we were then able to persuade them that actually, in terms of the level of risk that they would create, that they were within the parameters of what requirements B1 to B5 would allow.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I cannot recall the specifics of what those aspects of the design were.
Can I ask, is that generally your attitude to building control officers, that part of your job is to try and argue their comments away?
The job is twofold. Is on the one hand, we need to ensure the building is safe, while at the same time avoiding the lumbering a client with something that's over-engineered. I'm not going to sit in front of a building control officer and argue that black is white and try and push a substandard design, particularly as being a firefighter. If they do have a fire in the building, I may be then the one putting my own neck on the line trying to put that fire out. I'm not that suicidal. So, no, if there's something where the code says do something, and I'll say again, I've said this before, Approved Document B is a fairly blunt instrument. There are situations where code compliance would require the design to incorporate certain features, and you look at it and think, well, actually, if you omit or if you do something slightly differently, or the circumstances we've got here are not quite what the authors of the code had in mind for their usual common situations, and that actually the building absolutely achieves the level of safety that's necessary, then yes, precisely one of the reasons why I'm employed is to explain to building control why the building is safe, rather than necessarily explain to building control why the building is code compliant.
Mm. Do you ever feel that there's pressure or expectation from clients that that's your role to
There has been
engage
in the past.
with?
There has been in the past, and I've been fired off jobs before now for not putting in my reports what the client wants me to put in.
Yeah. Did you feel on the Calc project that there was an expectation that you would be trying to argue with building control and persuade them round to your views?
There was a pressure to persuade them of things that I felt were safe. There was not a pressure to convince them of things that I myself was uncomfortable with.
Yeah. Do you agree that best practice for a fire engineer is to engage openly and transparently with building control officers rather than seek to go into combat with them?
I mean, combat's a strong word. I mean, there's, and for that matter, I don't see that the combat might necessarily not be open.
Forget the
yes,
combat for a
so
moment.
So yes,
Do you-
it does.
do you
Yes,
agree
yes,
best
yes, it does
practice?
need to be open and transparent. As much as some of these discussions happen during a design team meeting when the only witnesses are the other members of the design team. So, I mean, as much as then the results will be minuted, and so the only record for third parties to see are the minutes. So, how open that is, okay, is sometimes debatable. But I mean, precisely the way you discuss these things is, in the quiet, calm, rationally in a quiet room, and not over, not in a pub. So, there's. It's not something where we're trying to do dodgy backroom deals, no.
Yeah, okay. Now, looking then, I want to ask you some questions about the content of issue 2 of the fire strategy that you reviewed. Can we go back to that? That's the EXO 401758. And I want to look at page 4 and the introduction to the report. And if we can just, that's better, yeah. So this is an introduction which explains the background to the proposed refurbishment, 24-storey residential block. And then we've seen this a number of times already, but I haven't shown it to you yet. The refurbishment then comprises a number of bullet points. Now, were you aware at this time when you were reviewing issue 2 that the refurbishment included overcladding?
Not that I recall, no.
So we know it's not included in this list. So you don't recall anybody saying to you around this time?
I've no recollections on that matter at all.
Did you feel that you had adequate information about the project to conduct a competent review of this strategy in terms of background to the project?
At the time, there was nothing that I felt that I needed that I didn't have. Looking at it subsequently, it would have been useful if I'd had minutes. They refer to discussions with the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. It would have probably been useful if I'd had access to the minutes of those meetings.
Yeah. So you could have seen what was discussed.
So, with hindsight, yes, there is other information that probably should have been available that maybe I should have asked for.
Yeah.
But at the time, bearing in mind that this is a document titled Outline Strategy, so it is a fairly brief high-level review, and so I wasn't really expecting that much information would be available other than those general arrangement drawings.
We know that a number of those design team meetings included reference to overcladding. Was that something that ideally you would have known at this time in terms of reviewing this outline fire safety strategy?
Probably yes.
Were you aware at what stage in the RIBA process? Now, I appreciate you said it wasn't typical in the fee proposal to break it down, but were you aware what
No.
stage the design team was
No.
at?
No.
So you weren't aware when you drafted this, when you reviewed this outline strategy, that, for example, Studio E's Stage D report had come in the August of 2013?
No.
Prior to
No.
this?
No.
And that their Stage C report had been the previous October 2012?
No.
You didn't know that? No. Had you read, prior to working on this, the existing fire safety strategy prepared by Exova that was authored by Ms Cooney and reviewed by Ms Barker?
Not as far as I recollect. No, I don't think I saw that report until after the fire.
Did you even know that such a report existed, that Exova had been commissioned to do a report on the existing fire safety strategy?
I must have known. Again, there's no specific recollection of what was in my memory at the time, but there was a separate, I think it was a sub-project rather than a project, there was a separate scope of works for the existing building. I must have been aware of that, so I must have been aware that something was going on.
Yeah.
But what that specifically entailed, I don't think I was aware, no. And what where the boundaries were between the scope of the refurbishment project and the work on the existing building, I was certainly completely ignorant of that.
Yeah. Had you known at the time that there was an existing fire safety strategy? Is that something you'd have wanted, ordinarily, when reviewing a report, that you'd have wanted to see before conducting such a review?
Probably yes. I say possibly with the caveat that if I were writing the report, it would have contained quite a lengthy summary of the existing fire safety strategy anyway.
Do you think that the fact that Mr Ashton hasn't made reference to that anywhere within this issue, he's not made any reference to the existing fire strategy, could that reflect this distinction you were talking about earlier between an Ashton report and a Pearson report?
Yes.
Yeah. That you would build on the existing in your reports?
Yes.
But he would focus on the changes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he would focus on what is the purpose of the report, and in this case, my understanding is the purpose of this report is to explain to building control why these works comply with Part B of the building regulations.
And when you say these works, you mean these works listed out in the introduction?
As listed on that, yeah.
You weren't aware that there were other works as well?
No.
And I think we've established it, but can I just check, had you been provided with any other design documentation that had come from the design team when you reviewed this? We talked about the two drawings that are at the bottom of this introduction.
I must have seen earlier floor plans of earlier iterations. I couldn't recall the specific details of which how many different versions I'd seen. I was aware that by sheer nature of the fact that we're talking about a change in rewording of the entire description of the means of escape here, I was aware that there had been previous iterations, and I had seen previous iterations of floor plans. Beyond the general arrangement floor plans and markups that colleagues had done with recommended fire resistance ratings, there's nothing else I can really recall.
Would you have expected by this time for a full suite of design documentation to have been provided to Exova as far as...
Not knowing where this stood in the context of the project and its programme, I didn't really know how much detail to expect and how much detail should have been provided.
So just back to the RIBA stage reports, did it occur to you at any time to check where in the RIBA stage process the design team were?
Nope. I mean, I just took it on trust that Terry knew how to manage a project at our end. He didn't need me to tell him how to do his job. So he'd asked me, can I review a report? He didn't ask me for advice as to whether that report was, whether the level of detail was appropriate for where we are in the project. So I really didn't know the context or where we were in the project programme at all.
And would you ever ask for a stage C or a stage D report from the architects existed? Would that ever be something that you might inquire as to?
Rarely. I mean, they're normally something that they will give you quite voluntarily. I mean, bearing in mind that it's a piece of work that usually architects are fairly proud of, so that it's not, getting that report off them is not a tooth extraction process.
Okay.
So yeah, if it's available, it would normally be provided to us.
Yeah.
If anything, the issues are the opposite. If they provide you with so much information, that actually trying to extract the relevant wood from a forest of trees is the difficulty.
Yeah. Let's look on at the requirement. I want to start with B3 and then we'll come and look at B4. So I want to look at B3. This is internal fire spread. If we go to page 8 of this. And there's the section B3 at 3.1.3 there. Now, under the heading fire resistance of elements of structure, just there, Mr. Ashton's identified that the floors should provide at least 60 minutes of fire resistance. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, shouldn't that have been 120 minutes fire resistance if applying approved document B at the time?
Applying approved document B as of 2012, yes, for a new build it should have been.
Yeah. But that was not something you picked up on your...
That's not something I picked up in my review.
Is that because you didn't think it was your role to check that kind of detail as part of the review process, or for some other reason?
I think more likely because I took it on trust that paragraph had been written was correct, and I can only... the only explanation I can give myself is that I wasn't as diligent as I might have been in reviewing it.
Understood.
I mean, there's looking at it with the benefit of hindsight, I can only presume that this was something that was agreed between Mr. Ashton and the building control surveyors at the time, based on an understanding of the design codes at the time of construction.
Yeah.
But if the next question is, should this have been explained? Well, that probably would have been useful, yes.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Under compartmentation then, the next heading, and there's various subparagraphs there about where compartment walls and all floors will be provided, and then there's more about standards of resistance. And it may be explained by the fact you didn't know about the overcladding, but I wanted to ask you about why this section doesn't deal with regulation B34, which states the building should be designed and constructed so that the unseen spread of fire and smoke within concealed spaces in its structure and fabric is inhibited. Did you note at the time that there wasn't any reference to B34?
Not consciously. And I can only sort of retrospectively try and reconstruct what my thought process must have been. It was not uncommon that for an outline report, so something that is intended for an early design stage, for that to be considered a level of detail that is not at this stage of the design yet relevant and would be inserted later.
When you say at this stage of the design, you didn't know what stage of the design they were at, did you?
But based on the fact that it calls itself an outline strategy rather than a strategy, So I would infer from that it is at a relatively early design stage and a relatively brief high-level document.
So do you think you assumed at the time that it was a stage C document as opposed to being a stage D-E document?
That's what the level of detail in the report implies.
Yeah. And on the B34 theme, did you notice at the time that there was no reference to, say, Section 9 of Approved Document B, which deals with location and provisions for cavity barriers in the external wall, as well as other locations?
Whether I consciously noticed it, I cannot recall.
So that wasn't something that you picked up at the time?
I would have commented, if I had picked it up, I'm guessing I would have commented on it.
Did it concern you that issue 2 of this outline fire safety strategy, you knew it was issue 2, didn't you?
Yes.
And you knew that the issue 1 had been a year before, because that's on the front page.
I
We
don't know
looked
how
at that.
much attention I paid to the dates on issue 1.
I see. Did it concern you that it omitted to identify the locations in Grenfell Tower that formed concealed spaces, or the locations that cavity barriers were required in order to comply with Section 9 of Approved Document B?
I say, based on the fact that this is calling itself an outline strategy and not a strategy, no, not particularly.
Okay. That was my next question. In your view, would addressing the need for cavity barriers be something that ought to be included as part of a fire safety strategy?
As part of a full strategy, yes.
And have you ever come across a situation in which you've put in the performance requirements for, say, cavity barriers, even if you don't know precisely what the design team have in mind, in order to give them guidance and to flag up that that's something they need to be thinking about?
I have done in the past, yes.
Yeah. When you reviewed this issue 2 of the strategy, were you aware that this was a high-rise block of flats with a stay-put evacuation strategy?
Yes.
And were you aware that such a strategy relies on a high degree of compartmentation?
Yes.
Did it concern you at all that the outline fire safety strategy made no reference to reliance on compartmentation in a building with a stay-put evacuation strategy?
Not particularly. I think, under the impression that all parties concerned were taking that as read.
I see.
And particularly if this document looks as if it is focused primarily on providing relevant information to the building control surveyors, and they will have been absolutely aware of that and wouldn't have needed us to remind them of that fact.
Do you agree that where a high degree of compartmentation is required, cavity barriers are particularly important, including, for example, around the windows?
Yes.
But you didn't flag up to Mr. Ashton at the time that there was no mention of cavity barriers in this?
No, I didn't.
Requirement B4 then is on that page in the next section, 3.1.4. And we looked before at the fee proposal, which said that the fire strategy would include determination of any external fire spread issues. When you did your review, were you concerned at all that all we have on the B4 requirement is that one sentence there? Did that strike any alarm bells with you?
I can't recall how much. I mean, obviously, there's the sentence being finished by "it will be confirmed." That's a flag for we don't yet have all the information we need. How concerned I was at the time, I cannot recollect.
Okay. When you say it's a flag for we don't yet have all the information we need, it doesn't say that, does it?
It doesn't say that, but
it says it's considered the proposed changes will have no adverse effect, but this will be confirmed by an analysis in a future issue. It goes further, doesn't it, than just we don't have enough information?
well, in the sense that there is obviously what it's saying is it's something that will need to be revisited. Yes.
Did you ever discuss this paragraph or B4 around this time with Mr. Ashton? Did you ever have any discussions with him about
Not in the specific context of this project.
No. So you were involved, I think we know, in the calc project at this time.
Yes.
And you were aware of the potential impact of cladding on fire spread, for
Yes.
example, from that project, yes?
Yes.
And we know that you were aware of numerous facade fires generally. Would you agree that this statement is clearly incorrect, even on the basis of just some form of cladding being proposed? Because any form of cladding has a potential effect on the ability
So,
to comply with
bearing in
B4.
mind at the time, I think I was completely ignorant of the fact that the works included overcladding.
Yeah, so that explains why you didn't pick that up. Yeah. When you reviewed this wording, did you understand what the proposed changes were, which Mr. Ashton was referring to?
The and as such, there probably are no changes. Must have been thinking primarily in the context of space separation. So sizes of non-fire resisting sections of external wall and sizes of compartment, and fire loads. So the two risk categories in the BR 187, the report on analysis methods in connection with space separation. The expectation is that the alteration is primarily the alteration being undertaken on the lower levels of the building.
Yeah.
That any changes to compartment sizes and changes to window sizes will not significantly impact the conclusion if one were to do a BR 187 analysis.
Yeah. Now, this point about space separation, I'm interested in this. That is it possible that at the time, any issues around external fire spread were considered only in terms of space separation, and that perhaps less emphasis was given to, say, Section 12 of ADB in general than Section 13?
It's certainly possible.
Would you agree with me at the time that fire engineers in your situation were often focusing on space separation, building to building flame spread, and that there was generally less focus on flame spread up and within the existing building?
I'd be hesitant to make any statement about fire engineers and the rest of the industry in general.
Fair enough. What about your practice?
As much as I have read fire safety strategies from some of our competitors in some contexts, I don't have enough of a recollection of what they said, and certainly not enough of a recollection of what may have been omitted to really draw any conclusions about what was normal practice throughout the rest of the industry.
Yeah, but take your practice, for example.
Certainly within Warrington Fire, there certainly was a tendency, particularly at the early design stages, to focus on space separation, bearing in mind that an outline strategy typically you would write for the pre-planning phase, and one of the aspects that planners need to concern themselves with is the external appearance, and so sizes of windows, and obviously the separation distance between buildings. So that is very much a focus of our considerations at a pre-planning phase, whereas the selection of materials then is something that can be left till a later. Often is something that can be left till a later date.
Yeah. So we know that Proof Document B, when it looks at B4, we've got Section 12, external fire spread, Section 13, space separation, and Section 14, roof coverings. It breaks it down into three. Does it follow from what you've said, and that a lot of the focus, particularly at the pre-planning stage, would be on space separation, that it's a fair comment to say that perhaps less focus would go on Section 12 and external fire spread?
At the pre-planning phase, certainly, yes.
And indeed, generally at this time?
At times, yes. I mean, as I said, certainly my own awareness grew during this period.
So looking back, let's think about 2013 when you did this review of this fire safety report. Would it be a fair comment to say that within Exova you would be less focused on Section 12 than you would on Section 13?
Generally speaking, probably yes.
Now, just in staying within this external fire spread point, did you think to question why there were no plans, sections or elevations relating to the external wall that you could review at this time?
No, I didn't. I mean, so having worked alongside Terry for 5 years, I assumed that if he had had that information and it was relevant at that design stage, he would have put it in the report.
Would it be normal to give advice on the B4 requirement without such plans, sections or elevations to hand?
Well, no, precisely because you can't.
Yeah.
Other than, I mean, this was, in this case, yeah, I think educated guess is probably the wrong term, but there's certainly an expectation of what we're likely to find.
Yeah.
But that's precisely then why there's then the caveat of this will need to be revisited.
Yeah. Were you aware at this time that Celotex FR5000 was planned to be used as the insulation behind the rain
I'd
screen?
never even heard of the product.
No.
I mean, I was aware that it was common practice to use polymer foams as insulation rather than materials of limited combustibility. That specific product, I don't think I'd ever heard of the product.
And did it occur to you at this time when you were reviewing this strategy to ask about insulation and the external?
As I said, I don't think I had any knowledge of the fact that there was any proposal to overclad the building at all.
Yeah.
So my recollection is I was just completely ignorant of that aspect of the project.
Thinking back, were you aware at the time of the provisions in 12.7 of ADB and the recommendation about materials of limited combustibility for insulation?
I can't recall how. I mean, I certainly hadn't memorised them. I mean, I'd read them, and as we said at the earlier on this morning, I was certainly aware that it's something to which attention must be paid. But precisely because any questions of detailed design I would usually give to colleagues, my familiarity with the details of those paragraphs was limited.
Yeah. Did you know anything about the top of the tower at this point? Did you know anything about the crown? Did you know whether there was going to be a crown? Was that ever discussed with you?
And even from the documents I've read subsequently, I still don't understand what was going on the top level.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I think that would be an appropriate moment,
Yes,
if that's
right.
okay, because I'm moving on to a topic that I'd like to do in more than 3 minutes. Or,
Well, that seems very sensible, right?
yeah, but we're making good progress.
Good.
Obviously, we always have to sweep up additional
yes,
questions,
yes,
and indeed, a lot of questions from core participants have already fed into my questioning, so it's a constant, ongoing process.
Oh, yes, I understand that. Good, thank you. Well, Mr. Pearson, Dr. Pearson, I'm sorry, we'll have a break at this stage for some lunch. We'll come back at 2 o'clock, please.
Okay.
And please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. All right? Thank you. I'd like to go with the usher, please. Good, thank you. 2 o'clock, please. Thank you.